So now we understand all the parts of this argument and how it fits together. Hooray! But we're not done. I'm sorry, there's more. I still need to show you how to evaluate complex arguments. Analyzing arguments is both figuring out how they work and evaluating them, which means determining how good they are at supporting their conclusions. Or you could think of it as determining whether you should be persuaded by the argument or not. So, I'm going to talk about how to evaluate arguments generally for a little bit, and then we're going to return to this example and practice those techniques. And as usual, I bet you will get more out of the example than out of me explaining how to evaluate arguments in the abstract. Now, we have already talked about evaluating arguments a couple of times, and that's because each form of inference we've discussed comes with its own method or criteria for evaluating it. For example, we evaluate a deductive argument by determining whether it has a valid argument pattern and whether the premises are acceptable. And we evaluate an argument by analogy by determining whether the two things being compared are mostly similar or mostly different in ways that are relevant to the claim being made. And also determining whether the premises are acceptable. We always do that. There are, however, methods for evaluating an argument that don't depend on its form of inference that apply to pretty much all arguments, and I'm going to show you one of those now. This is the Ross model of argument, named after Batman Begins villain Ra's al Ghul. No, not really. It's Ross, R-A-S, which is short for relevance, acceptability, and sufficiency. You can find different texts that use different names for these criteria, but I like relevance, acceptability, and sufficiency because that's Ross, and who doesn't like a good acronym? Or an acronym, anyway. So relevance, acceptability, and sufficiency are the three criteria that any argument must meet in order to be a good argument. If it fails to meet any one of them, it is not a good argument and you shouldn't be persuaded by it. You check each individual premise for relevance and acceptability, usually, and the premises taken as a whole for sufficiency. Let's talk about relevance first. Relevance means, of course, that the premises need to be related to the conclusion, meaning that they have to be talking about the same thing. But it's not enough that they be talking about the same thing. If I'm trying to convince you that my car could beat your car in a fight, the fact that my car has a Decepticon emblem on it isn't going to be relevant, even though it's a fact about my car and therefore it's about the same thing. The premise needs to be related in a way that makes the conclusion more likely to be true. I realize this seems pretty obvious, but it's actually quite common for people to get it wrong. For example, while I was preparing this lecture, my girlfriend was listening to the Cardi B trial slash lawsuit, and she made me listen to it too. I normally avoid anything related to celebrities, but I didn't mind listening to this because it was very entertaining. It was absolutely full of examples of irrelevant premises, in fact. So here's the background, in case you don't already know. Cardi B is a famous person. She's a singer, I think, and she was on her way to see her doctor when she had an altercation with a security guard. This is what the trial is about. The security guard started filming her with her phone, and Cardi B said, "Can you please stop filming me?" And it sort of escalated from there. The security guard alleged that Cardi B scratched her face and she was suing her to get her to pay for her plastic surgery or something. It was actually kind of hard to tell what was going on because the lawyer mostly talked about irrelevant things. Okay, you have to imagine the plaintiff's lawyer. You have to imagine that Cardi B is on the witness stand and the plaintiff's lawyer is questioning her right now because that's what was happening. So they were talking about this point in the altercation where the security guard yelled at Cardi B, "Get the fuck out of my building," or something like that. And the lawyer asked Cardi a question. He asked, "Would you agree that if a security guard tells you to leave the premises, you should leave?" That was his question for her. My question for you is, do you see how that's unrelated to what his client was alleging, that Cardi B scratched up her face? The whole thing was like that. He asked her about her hair. He asked her questions about her career. It was ridiculous. You can go and watch it yourself. Now, here is another example, which is far less whimsical, but probably worth drawing to your attention. So, at the time of recording, the time that I was recording this, Republicans, who are the conservative political party in the United States, remember? They were pushing the FBI to designate trans people as terrorists. Here's an article about it. I'll put the URL in the slides. They did this in response to the Charlie Kirk shooting that happened in September. Was Charlie Kirk shot by a trans person? No. He was shot by a straight cis man. It's always a straight cis man. But according to some sources, the shooter dated a trans woman, and this is their justification. This guy was involved with a trans woman at some point in time, allegedly, and he did political violence. Therefore, trans people are violent extremists. You see how the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises? The fact that a man who did political violence once dated a trans woman does not support the conclusion that trans people do political violence. I think that's pretty obvious. Nevertheless, this was their justification. So, as you can see, it is not hard to find arguments that fail to meet the relevance criterion in real life. The second criterion is acceptability, and we've talked about this before. In fact, because this lecture is running long and I'm quite tired, I'm just going to insert a clip from a previous lecture in here explaining what acceptability is. Clip.
Now, I prefer the language of acceptable rather than true because there are a lot of things that can't really be proven, but we still accept them as true. For example, we can't prove that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but everybody accepts that it will. Likewise, some kinds of claims aren't strictly true or false, but we accept them anyway because everybody, or nearly everybody, agrees. For example, murder is wrong. Is it a fact that murder is wrong? Is that the sort of thing that could even be a fact? It's not something that you could, it's certainly not something that you could show to be true through observation. Nevertheless, it is a claim that we would accept because just about everybody agrees that murder is wrong. And so this is why I prefer the language of asking whether a premise is acceptable rather than asking whether a premise is true. If we decide a premise is acceptable, it means we're going to treat it as if it were true. It's not acceptable in the sense of I'm okay with that. It's acceptable in the sense that I'm willing to believe that, or I'm willing to grant that that's true, something like that. We accept a premise when it's common knowledge or otherwise non-debatable. There are certain things that are not necessarily common knowledge, but you wouldn't debate them. For example, subjective claims. If I say to you, I'm hungry, that's not common knowledge, but it's also, you're also not going to argue with me. You're not going to try to prove to me that I'm not hungry. We also accept a premise if the premise is supported by evidence or reasons that we accept, which is a way of saying we'll accept a premise if we're given an argument in support of that premise, and the argument in support of it has premises that are themselves acceptable. Finally, we accept a premise when it's backed up by a citation from an authoritative source.
Now, sometimes you have an argument where the premises are acceptable and they're also relevant, meaning they give you reason to think that the conclusion is true, but it's still not a successful argument because the premises don't give you enough support to think that the conclusion is true. Remember this slide from when I was talking about inductive arguments? The fact that my cat hates getting wet does support the conclusion that cats in general hate getting wet. One cat is evidence of the class of all cats. And you got to admit, people do draw conclusions about groups from a single example all the time. For instance, I knew this woman who hated men from Newfoundland because a friend of hers dated a man from Newfoundland who was abusive to her friend, I mean. But we know that a sample size of one isn't enough evidence to draw a general conclusion. It's not no evidence, it's just not enough evidence. It's not sufficient evidence. Or consider this. You're thinking of buying a car, and your friend says, you should buy an electric car because it would be good for the environment. Is this a reason to buy an electric car? Is it relevant? Sure. But if so, why doesn't everybody drive an electric car? Well, because there's a variety of reasons that potentially impact what car you buy if you're buying a car. Electric cars are usually more expensive, for example. So this is a reason, but by itself, it's not enough reason. And this brings us back to complex arguments. The gun control example we just finished reconstructing had 4 arguments in support of its conclusion. Why? Why did it have 4 arguments instead of just 1? Well, probably because the author thought that one argument might not be persuasive enough. This is why people use the strategy of multiple independent arguments. Well, one reason anyway. They do it in order to meet the criterion of sufficiency. Now, whereas it's relatively clear-cut whether a premise is relevant or acceptable, sufficiency is quantitative and sensitive to contextual factors. Let's say you hear that a diet low in red meat reduces your risk of colon cancer. You look into it and you find that the research isn't very strong. There's only one study on it, and whereas the study did show a noticeable effect, we'd be more confident if there were a bunch of studies, right? But on the other hand, colon cancer is really bad, and giving up red meat isn't that big of a deal for you, so This illustrates that sometimes the bar for accepting an argument doesn't have to be very high. You could stop eating red meat just in case. At the other end of the spectrum, in a criminal court, the bar is very high. Here, we require guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Some evidence of guilt isn't enough. The case needs to be so strong that it would be unreasonable to believe that the defendant is innocent before we convict them. A prison sentence can ruin someone's life, after all. In addition, there's the matter of what other arguments are out there. Remember when I talked about proposal arguments? When it comes to social issues, there are almost always two sides to consider, for and against. Any given proposal has potential harms and benefits. So there's evidence that in people who are at risk for schizophrenia, using cannabis can significantly increase that risk. Is this a reason to make cannabis use illegal or keep it illegal in places where it's still illegal or make it illegal again here in Canada? You know what I mean. It's a reason, certainly. But on the other hand, schizophrenia is quite rare. 1% of Canadians, according to Google. This means that cannabis use is safe for 99% of people. Now, protecting 1% of people can be worth it. If there's 175 million people in Canada, 1% is 1.75 million people. That's still a lot. But consider the costs of criminalizing cannabis. If you criminalize cannabis, you'll be sending to jail lots of people who didn't do anything wrong. Prisons are expensive, and any amount of time that cops spend arresting pot smokers is time that they're not spending on something more important. And then there's all of that sweet, sweet money that the government is making off of selling cannabis. Do you see what I'm driving at? Whether any given argument meets the criterion of sufficiency is going to depend on both what's at stake in the situation and how compelling the arguments from the other side are. So I can't give you a metric that's going to apply in every case. When it comes to sufficiency, it's always, to some extent, a judgment call. There's going to be arguments that are clearly not sufficient, like the examples that I gave you, and there are going to be arguments that clearly are sufficient, but sometimes it's going to be hard to decide. C'est la vie. Now here is a step-by-step method for evaluating arguments that sums up what I've said about it in tonight's lecture. It functions mostly as a series of reminders to think about the various things that I've mentioned. I'm not going to read it out loud. You should pause the video and read it, and then I'm going to show you how it works using the same complex argument that we reconstructed earlier in this lecture. Now we're going to evaluate this argument. We have already reconstructed it, so that's nice. So we will proceed to step 2, where it says determine the form of inference. But it also says that if the argument is complex, we need to determine the form of inference for the main argument and each subordinate argument separately. And then we have to evaluate each one separately, starting with the subordinate arguments, because it's the subordinate arguments that provide support for the premises that directly support the main conclusion. We already talked about this, so that's how we're going to do it, starting from the top. However, you may remember that we already talked about this argument for a while when I was using it to illustrate the critical reading techniques. And when we did that, we actually came up with a few critical remarks, a few remarks having to do with the evaluation of it. So it might be worth having a look at those. Instead of going back and looking through that whole video, what I have done is I have retrieved an example of flagging and note-taking that I did expanding upon the stuff that I wrote into the document during the video, because I say that the flagging and note-taking is something that is better done with pencil written on the actual document. Let's have a look. So I've got a note over here. What kind of crimes? States with the toughest gun laws have the highest gun rates. What kind of crimes? Okay. Do you remember when we talked about this? We noted, or someone noted, that states with the toughest gun laws have the highest crime rates. But what kind of crimes? Are they crimes that have to do with guns? Like, are they gun crimes? Are they shootings? Are they holdups using guns? It doesn't say. I mean, if it's just crime overall, if it's just an average of all kinds of crimes, well, the vast majority of crimes don't involve guns, so it's unlikely that how many guns there are would have much of an effect on the overall rate of crime if it includes crime that doesn't involve guns. What else? Over here, is this true? Is what true? Registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. Oh, yeah. So we noted back then that obviously registering cars and licensing drivers reduces traffic accidents. I mean, imagine if we got rid of all of our traffic laws now and let just anybody drive a car, not just people who are qualified to drive a car. Do you think that there would be a noticeable increase in the number of car accidents? Yeah. With millions of highly restricted laws, and then I circled millions and wrote really. Oh yeah, millions of highly, it's talking about traffic laws. I don't think that there are millions of traffic laws in the US. I mean, that sounds quite silly, and kind of somebody who says that it kind of makes it hard to take them seriously. Oh, and that's a pro tip for writing your own essays too. Avoid exaggeration if you want people to take you seriously. Okay, it says here citation needed for 15,000 shot to death and for the car accidents. Yeah, citation needed for all the statistics. Like cars, guns are dangerous tools. Strange choice of words. We don't normally call cars or guns tools. True. Guns are tools, not evil instruments capable of their own malevolence. And I wrote, who says they are? Oh, yes. Well, this has to do with how the fifth paragraph I don't think is really part of the argument. I think it's mostly a summary. And the thing about this, well, it's an example of a straw man fallacy. And we'll get into what that is a couple of weeks from now when we talk about fallacies. And that's it for the notes, I guess. So let's go back to the reconstruction. Now we're going to go through the subordinate arguments and evaluate them one at a time. In order to do that, we need to first evaluate its form of inference because the different forms of inference have different criteria by which they're evaluated. And we also need to check them for relevance, acceptability, and sufficiency. First one, if anti-gun laws worked, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws would have the lowest crime rates. States with the toughest anti-gun laws don't have the lowest crime rates. Therefore, anti-gun laws don't work. What is the form of inference? Well, you may remember that we reconstructed this by applying one of the valid deductive argument patterns that we learned. So that means this is a deductive argument. Deductive arguments only have to be examined for acceptability and relevance. This is because the way a deductive argument works, if the premises are true and it has one of the valid deductive argument patterns, then the conclusion must also be true. We already know that it has one of the valid deductive argument patterns, so all we have to do is see if the premises are acceptable. Isn't that nice? Premise one, if anti-gun laws worked, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws would have the lowest crime rates. Is this an acceptable premise? Now, I would think that this would, at first glance, seem to be a common sense claim. Hey, if anti-gun laws worked, if they stopped crimes, then the places with the toughest anti-gun laws would have the lowest crime rates, right? And that does seem true at first glance, but we noticed the problem. We noticed the problem when we went over this doing the critical reading steps, and I alluded to that a few minutes ago. Lowest crime rates. What kind of crimes? What kind of crimes? Only certain crimes involve guns, so we would only expect gun legislation to have an effect on crimes that involve guns. And nothing here specifies whether these lowest crime rates are they the lowest rates of gun crime? So if anti-gun laws worked, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws would have the lowest rates of gun crime. Okay, I think most of us would accept that. But if it just says crime generally, well, most types of crime don't involve guns. So no, we couldn't, if we were just talking general crime statistics, then no, we wouldn't assume that laws restricting the use of guns would necessarily have an impact on crimes that don't involve guns. The second premise, states with the toughest anti-gun laws don't have the lowest crime rates. Okay, so this is like paraphrased. The first two of them are paraphrased because it says states with the toughest anti-gun laws, such as New York and Washington. And we could look up the statistics for New York and Washington to determine whether they have the lowest crime rates, but we shouldn't have to. Statistical claims should come with citations to back them up. In fact, we said that empirical claims generally, if they're not common knowledge or obviously true, need to be backed up by citations. Otherwise, it's just a guy saying stuff. And furthermore, what period of time is he talking about? And furthermore, what kind of crime rates? As you can see, there's a number of problems here, so we can't just really take him at his word. So actually, both of these premises are unacceptable. And we ought to keep track of that somehow. So how about if they're unacceptable, I will highlight them in red. There, okay? Well, if both of the premises are unacceptable in a deductive argument, the argument fails. And in fact, if all of the premises are unacceptable in any form of argument, the argument is going to fail. So we're off to a good start. Maybe this won't take very long. The second one says, restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Taking guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens makes it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Therefore, criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. What is the form of inference here? Well, you'll see how P4 and P5 sort of need to function together in order for the conclusion to follow. That's a hint that it might be a deductive argument. It doesn't fit any of the deductive argument patterns, the valid ones that we covered. That by itself doesn't make it not a deductive argument. It could be a different pattern. I'm going to go with this is a deductive argument. I mean, it's not an inductive argument or an argument by analogy or a conceptual argument. Let's go with deductive argument. Now let's have a look at the premises. Restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Do we accept that claim? Well, that depends on what you mean by restricting gun ownership, right? We know what kind of restriction on gun ownership is being considered. It is having guns registered, and people need to have licenses to carry guns. So, similar to driving cars. Requiring licenses for gun in order to own or carry a gun and registering the guns, does that take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens? Well, does it? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No, it doesn't. Because law-abiding citizens can always get a gun license and register their guns or buy their guns from a registered gun vendor. So requiring licenses for guns does not mean that you can't own a gun, right? It just means that you have to pass some sort of test for owning a gun. We didn't go into that, and the author didn't go into that. And maybe if we had read the text that he was responding to, they might have been more specific. But generally, requiring a license for a gun involves something like a background check. So basically, they see if you have a criminal record. And if you don't have a criminal record, if you're a law-abiding citizen, that means you can buy a gun. So this premise is simply not true. Requiring licenses for guns and registration for guns does not take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. If if the requirement of a license or registration would keep you from owning a gun, well, then you're probably not a law-abiding citizen. Sounds like it's keeping guns out of the wrong hands. Okay, so if this is a deductive argument, wait, I need to highlight it in red. There. Now, if this is a deductive argument, both of the premises need to be true in order for the conclusion to be true. So technically, we already know that this argument fails, but this is for practice. So let's look at the next premise. Taking guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens makes it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Do we accept this premise? Is this an empirical claim? Is it a conceptual claim? Is it a value claim? I think this is a common sense claim. It's one of those things that's not exactly common knowledge, but it seems to be true if you think about it. It just seems to be common sense that a person carrying a gun would be less easy to prey upon by a criminal than a person who doesn't have a gun, right? Actually, wait. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure that that makes sense. It depends on what kind of crime we're talking about. If we're talking about identity theft, I don't think carrying a gun is going to protect you from identity theft or having your car stolen. I mean, what are the situations where carrying a gun would make you less susceptible to being the victim of a crime? Is he imagining things like street muggings? I think he's imagining things like street muggings. Well, have you ever have you ever been mugged in the street? Do you know anybody who's been mugged in the street? It's actually quite rare. And in situations like that, owning a gun doesn't necessarily protect you. Like, I don't want to go into it. You can check the sort of thing out for yourself. But common sense, here's a common sense argument. If somebody pulls a knife on me in a dark street and says, "Give me your wallet," and I have a gun hidden inside my jacket, if I go for my gun, he might stab me with his knife before I get the gun out. Or maybe if I get the gun out, he'll grab the gun. The point is, I haven't seen the statistics on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if carrying a gun does not actually make you more safe in the event of a mugging. I think generally speaking, the when a gun is around, everybody is less safe. I'm not convinced that even in the case of home invasion, whether guns make you any more safe. And I'll remind you that if we're talking about crime generally and not just the specific instances of, let's say, violent crime, well, having a gun isn't going to protect you from identity theft or having your laptop stolen. The vast majority of crimes, having a gun doesn't protect you, and quite possibly having a gun makes you less safe under the conditions where you might use the gun to defend yourself. So I'm going to have to say that this premise is at best doubtful, which means it's not acceptable. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Registering guns and licensing gun owners is like registering cars and licensing drivers. Registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. Therefore, registering guns and licensing drivers won't reduce gun deaths. Do you remember what form of inference this is? This is an argument by analogy. This is how you evaluate an argument from analogy. First, you identify the two things being compared. Then you list the relevant similarities between the two things and the relevant differences, and you judge whether the things are more similar or more different in relevant respects. And that means respects relevant to the particular claim being made. Well, what are the two things being compared? The two things being compared are registering guns and licensing gun owners is being compared to registering cars and licensing drivers. And the claim being made is that registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. Hey, wait a minute. Registering cars and licensing drivers does reduce traffic accidents. We already decided that it does. So this claim here, premise 8, is false. Well, if the claim being made about the one thing that's compared to the other thing is false, that is another way for an argument from analogy to fail. That's actually on the next slide, following the slide that I showed you. So we don't even need to compare registering guns and licensing gun owners to registering cars and licensing drivers. But I will mention that in this case, the more similar the cars thing is to the guns thing, that actually makes it that actually would weigh against the author's conclusion that registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce car deaths because, sorry, won't reduce gun deaths because we know that registering cars and licensing drivers does reduce traffic accidents. So if registering guns and licensing gun owners is like registering cars and licensing drivers, then yeah, registering guns and licensing gun owners would reduce gun deaths. What do we do with P10? Well, we said that P10 supports P8, which would mean that P10 is a premise for P8. So P10 arrow to, wait, hang on. I can show you. So that would mean that P10 to P8 here would be its own subordinate argument in support of premise number 8, which would be a subordinate conclusion in this case. But we've already decided that P8 is false. Well, I mean, let's give him the benefit of the doubt if there is a doubt. I'm not sure that there is a doubt, but let's be charitable and see what information he gives us in support of his claim registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. With millions of highly restrictive laws, still about 44,000 Americans die yearly in traffic accidents. Aha! Do you know why I just said aha? Uh, Let me show you. Here's an example of the misleading use of statistics. A single statistic used to suggest a trend. Violent crime rates in our cities are getting worse all the time, with over 1,200 shootings last year in New York City alone. So here, the claim that's being made is violent crime rates are getting worse, but the evidence in support of it is just the number of shootings in New York City just last year. So in order to suggest that violent crime rates are getting worse, you would need to show a number of, you would need to show the violent crime rate statistics for a series of years, right? And you would have to show that as time goes on, the number gets higher, but they only give you one number, so you can't infer a trend from that. In the same way, you can't use the number of deaths due to traffic accidents to infer that registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. You would need to compare the statistic of deaths and driving accidents when there are the laws versus when there isn't usage with when there isn't legal restrictions on the usage of cars. That's the only way that you could know how effective the restrictions were. I mean, no one is making the claim that registering cars and licensing drivers is going to have the effect that there will be no car accidents. The claim is that there would be fewer car accidents. And the fact that there are a lot, apparently, of car accidents doesn't tell us whether there would be fewer or more or the same number if the laws didn't exist, right? There's always going to be some number. The laws can't reduce it to zero. So given the fact that there are a number of car accidents or even a large number of car accidents, we can't infer from that registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't work. As far as we know, if we didn't register cars and licensed drivers, it would be 440,000 people dying in America each year in traffic accidents, right? So the argument P10 to P8 fails because it makes that mistake with statistics, but also, where is my mouse pointer? But also, it says with millions of highly restrictive laws, but there aren't millions of traffic laws. That's a ridiculous claim. So, apart from the misleading use of statistics, that claim is still technically false, which means that we cannot accept this claim. We've almost reached the end of the list of subordinate arguments, and they have all failed. Let's see if he pulls it out of the red zone with the last one. Guns are like kitchen knives and chainsaws. Oh, I don't like where this is going. We don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws. Therefore, we should not register or restrict guns. Okay, so this is another argument by analogy. And just a few minutes ago, I said that we evaluate an argument by analogy by identifying the things being compared, determining their relevant similarities and differences, and then if they are more different in relevant ways, then the argument fails. And if they're more similar in relevant ways, then the argument succeeds. But also, the claim that is made in the second premise, the claim about the one thing that is then supposed to be applied to the other thing, also needs to be true. Why don't we look at that first? We don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws. Okay, so actually we've already been here. I I strongly suspect that there are laws against carrying around kitchen knives and chainsaws in public. So actually premise 12 is false. I think also that when we talked about this before, when you were doing the critical reading techniques, I think we decided that guns are not that much like kitchen knives and chainsaws. One seemingly relevant difference is that kitchen knives and chainsaws are useful tools. You use kitchen knives to cut food and chainsaws to cut down trees, I assume. Uh, but guns are used for killing people. Guns are just for killing people. I mean, people also use guns for hunting, but really, this whole debate is about handguns, pistols, the kind that you can carry around concealed. Nobody walks around in public carrying a shotgun. That's not what the argument is about. So, given that guns are only useful for killing people, we could make the claim that, unlike kitchen knives and chainsaws, guns have no legitimate use, right? You need, let me put it this way, you need knives in order to cook, but you don't need guns. Nobody needs guns. Well, maybe cops and soldiers need guns. That's a debatable thing. There's people who think that cops do need to carry guns, and people who think that cops shouldn't carry guns. But again, this isn't about cops. This is about regular people. Do regular people need guns? So I think the takeaway here is that there's a problem with the comparison between kitchen knives and chainsaws, which are things that are needed to perform certain tasks, which can also be used to kill people, misused to kill people, versus guns whose actual purpose, what they're made for, is to kill people. So that seems to be a very relevant difference. So I would say that the argument by analogy would fail, even if the claim that we don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws were true, which it isn't. So much for the subordinate arguments. What about the main argument? The main argument would be the argument that consists of the four subordinate conclusions, which which are the premises in support of the main conclusion. Well, the point of having subordinate arguments is to support your premises, which are there to support the main conclusion. And so if all of your subordinate arguments fail, it would make all of these premises unacceptable, right? If the argument fails to support the claims that are there to support the main conclusion, then the argument fails to support the main conclusion. I think that's intuitive. In some cases, there can be premises which have subordinate arguments in support of them that don't necessarily need supported arguments. What I'm saying is it's possible that these SCs, that one or more of them, we might be inclined to accept, even if the subordinate argument that supports it isn't very good. I have a feeling that's not the case, but why don't we have a look? Okay, so now we're just going to consider each one of these subordinate conclusions as if it were a premise, ignoring the premises in support of it, because we've rejected pretty much all the premises in support of them. But maybe one of these claims could be, I don't know, like a common sense claim or something. Anti-gun laws don't work. Okay, well, is that obviously true? Um, is it doubtful? Is it unclear? This is a claim that we would not just take at somebody's word. If somebody comes up to you and says, anti-gun laws don't work, you would demand an argument in support of that. And he gave you an argument in support of that, and the argument failed. So I don't think we ought to accept this premise, which is also a subordinate conclusion. Next, criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. Well, I think the same thing applies as before. It's not self-evidently true that criminals benefit when gun ownership. We already talked about that actually when we went over the subordinate argument. Having a gun doesn't protect you from most kinds of crime, and it's doubtful that it protects you even from violent crime. So, no, uh, this is it's not acceptable. Registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce gun deaths. Well, okay, so this again is not something that we would accept at somebody's word. It's not obviously true. It's not even likely to be true. It's quite counterintuitive, right? I mean, why would we be having a debate about whether controlling or restricting who has a gun unless we thought that it would reduce gun deaths? So no, like that one also does not stand up by itself. And SC13 is basically the same as the main conclusion. In other words, and so if the main conclusion requires support, then this requires support. So no, I was right. The subordinate conclusions do not stand up on their own without the subordinate arguments. Usually they don't. So the argument fails. All of the subordinate arguments fail. Almost all of the premises are unacceptable. When I picked this one to use as an example for illustrating how to deal with complex arguments, I knew it had some problems, but going in, I did not know that we were going to end up rejecting almost every premise. I didn't know that it was going to turn out as bad as it turned out to be. So I guess we learned something here. I should say one other thing. When you're dealing with the argument strategy of multiple independent arguments, you remember I explained earlier what multiple independent arguments are? They don't need, each one of them doesn't need the other subordinate arguments in order for it to work. So if you're dealing with, let's say you're dealing with one like this, let's say it has four, you have a main conclusion and it's supported by four subordinate arguments and they are independent. Well, that means that it's possible for us to say that this one doesn't work, the first one, and for us to say that the second one doesn't work, and maybe also the third one doesn't work. But hey, maybe the fourth one, since it's independent of all of the rest and it doesn't require all of the rest to work, maybe it would be strong enough for us to accept the main conclusion anyway. I mean, this is the question of sufficiency, right? So sufficiency in an argument is about, okay, maybe we do accept these premises, but even if these premises are true, does that provide enough support to make the conclusion most likely true? So if we rejected one or two, or maybe even three of these subordinate arguments, if we decided that they failed, there was still a chance that the argument could succeed, assuming that the remaining subordinate arguments were quite strong. That wasn't the case here. All of the subordinate arguments failed, but I wanted to mention that possibility. Most arguments that you come across or that I ask you to evaluate are not going to be as bad as this one. And like I said, I didn't actually plan on having one that was this bad. So in those cases, if you're dealing with a argument strategy of multiple independent arguments, you might have to judge sufficiency. Let's say in some alternate timeline, we accepted this last one. Guns are like kitchen knives and chainsaws. We don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws. Therefore, we should not register or restrict guns. Okay, so let's say that we didn't find a problem with that. Would that by itself be enough to persuade us of the main conclusion, or should it be enough to persuade us? We don't restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws, so we shouldn't create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. That is being just one factor. I mean, the argument, we don't restrict this thing, therefore we shouldn't restrict this thing. On the whole, not very compelling. Well, that is the end of our example of how to reconstruct and evaluate a complex argument. That is the end of this week's lecture. I hope that you found it interesting. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time.